Today's book summary is on The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. This was Malcolm Gladwell's first book. He's one of my favorite authors. I love his stuff, and I'm finally getting around to reading The Tipping Point. This was written back in 2000. I didn't realize how old this book was until after I was done. But as I was listening to it, I kept hearing some references that seemed kind of dated, like talking about how much the fax machine has revolutionized stuff. And once I was done, I went back and, oh yeah, okay, that's why we're talking about this. But nevertheless, it was an interesting book. Not as good as his more recent works, but still, there was a lot of good stuff in here. So the title of the book, The Tipping Point, refers to an epidemic, and it refers to the point that in an epidemic where it reaches critical mass. And all of a sudden, things start to happen really fast, really noticeably fast. For a while, things will build up, and you don't notice, and then it gets to the tipping point, and all of a sudden, boom, it's like it's everywhere. So he talks about a lot of fads, a lot of trends. He talks about the sales of Airwalk shoes. I don't even remember those. He talks about the sales of a lot of different products and how they catch on. He explains how there are certain people called mavens who are the ones who really make all of this stuff work, who really spread the news of new products, and they're the big influencers that influence large groups of people. A lot of discussion around that. He says that he talked about an experiment. And you've probably heard about this or some version of it where they did an experiment where people were supposed to hear somebody next to them having an epileptic fit. And when it was just one person in the room and they heard someone next to them, 85% of the test subjects called for help. But then when there was 4 people, only 31% of them called for help. And what it comes down to is when people are in a group, they are much less likely to respond. They're much less likely to be a good Samaritan. You're much more likely to help somebody out when you think you're the only person who's going to help them. He talks about this term connectors. He says that connectors are the ones who link people together, and they know a lot of people. Some people will know a very small amount of people. Other people will know very large groups of people, and they want to introduce all these people together. And they may be mavens. Let's see. Another topic, he asks, why is it that stores can't constantly advertise sales prices? I mean, after all, most consumers won't ever notice this, but there actually is a small percentage of consumers who will. And those are the mavens. The mavens know prices. They enjoy knowing prices. They remember prices. They like telling people about good deals. They hand out coupons, and they're on top of all that stuff. I feel like my late grandfather, Oscar, must have been one of those. He would constantly talk about, the price of this or that at the grocery store has gone down 5 cents this week. I don't know. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But I should have thought of him listening to this. Malcolm Gladwell's books kind of jump all over. He talks about a lot of different interesting studies. He told the story about how Peter Jennings helped Reagan win the election. Every time they did a study and they looked at the facial expressions of 3 different newscasters, Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, and Dan Rathers. And every time they would talk about Reagan, they'd look to see if their face lit up or not. And they'd show this to people, and they wouldn't let the people know what they're talking about. The audio would be down. They'd have no idea what the context was, but people would say either they're happy to talk about this or they're not. So it was kind of a blind test or a blind study. And whenever Peter Jennings would talk about Reagan, he would smile and his face would kind of light up, but not so for Mondale. I think it was Mondale. When it came to Brokaw and Rathers, they had neutral expressions for either one, but Jennings definitely favored Reagan. And what do you think the voter turnout was for the people who watched his station, his news station? Way higher voting for Reagan, just based on his facial expressions. Fascinating stuff. And it's the stuff that, it wasn't intentional, and he denied it, and the station denied it, and everybody said this isn't possibly true. But I mean, we've got the data. The data doesn't lie. It really works. Emotions are contagious. It affects people. There was a lot about Sesame Street in here, about how revolutionary Sesame Street was, about how they went on. Well, it talks about the successes and failures of Sesame Street, how they went on a limb to do this, how they really didn't want to mix the real world with the imaginary world, and they kept cutting the show back to Sesame Street, where it was all live characters, and they completely lost kids. The street, the real life street stuff was supposed to be what tied the whole show together, and it was really important to them, but they kept losing kids, and it did not work until they made a switch, and they said, we're going to incorporate Muppets onto the street. We're going to mix real life and imaginary characters. And as soon as they did that, they engaged kids. Kids were all in on the show. And Sesame Street was very successful. It helped kids learn. However, when Blue's Clues came around, which was an unimaginative, extremely boring show where the shovel's name, the character of the shovel, his name was Shovel. The pail, his name was Pail. And I mean, it's just completely slow and boring. There's no jokes. There's nothing that adults would get. Unlike Sesame Street, I mean, there's a lot of humor in Sesame Street that only adults will get. It's supposed to be something where adults and kids will be able to watch it together. That was always Sesame Street's goal. But for Blue's Clues, no. The target audience was kids. And you know what happened in the ratings? Blue's Clues trounced Sesame Street on every possible metric for kids. Not like it was competition, or maybe it was, I don't know. But as far as anything they could measure, Blue's Clues kicked their butts. And it's because they catered the show just to one audience, and it's little kids, and they made it extremely repetitive. They would run the exact same show 5 days in a row, Monday through Friday. It's the exact same show over and over again, and kids actually enjoy that repetition. And at first, they kind of get tired of a song, but then they actually start to enjoy it. So that was fascinating. And then let's see, last thing I'll share was there was a lot in this book about how the maximum number of social relationships that we can have is 150. And this is seen over and over again in different societies, in different groups, in companies, in churches. Once they reach 150, people can't know everybody in that group anymore, and it starts to lose cohesiveness. And groups should try to limit people within the groups to 150 or less. It's kind of a magic number. Oh, and you know what? I missed maybe one of the most important parts of this book. I think this was kind of what the book originally started out as, was looking at crime in New York City in the mid-'80s. Crime just kept increasing and increasing and increasing, and it was getting worse and worse. There was a shooting on a subway where one guy pulled out a gun on 4 people who came up to him, like telling him, "Give me your money." And they were just being threatening. He pulled out a gun. He shot all 4 of them. And this guy ended up getting off basically scot-free, I think. And it took a look into that and wondering what led up to this. Why was crime getting so bad? Why would somebody just go out with a gun and be willing to shoot people? And a lot of this boiled down to something called the broken windows theory. And it's that when you're in a neighborhood, when you see broken windows on different houses or buildings, you get the idea that it's run down and nobody cares about it, and you won't care about it. And it makes you much less likely to care about anything else in your neighborhood, less likely to pick up garbage, less likely to do any of this stuff. And the idea is don't leave broken windows. Don't leave things looking badly in your neighborhood. Don't let people paint subway cars with graffiti. They started getting extremely, what's the word? They got on top of this, and they would not allow vandals to paint subway cars with graffiti anymore. If it was stainless steel, they would get an industrial cleaner and they'd clean it off the second there was graffiti on it, and they would not run those trains with graffiti. If it was a painted car, they would paint over it. And they got extremely zealous about this. They started busting people for hopping the turnstiles, for skipping the subway fare, and they started making arrests for this. And they would arrest like large groups of people. Once they had like 10 or 20 people arrested at one time, then they'd bring them all down to the station, and then they'd find guns and repeat offenders and people who have warrants out. It started turning into a huge crackdown, and people stopped trying to beat the fare, and it did a lot of stuff in New York City to drastically reduce the crime rate. All these tiny little things that add up to a big change. It's kind of like the compound interest effect. It's where all these little things start to add up, and you don't notice one or two of them, but over time it gets to a point where it reaches critical mass, and it's crazy. So, fascinating book. Not as good as some of his more recent ones, but good book nonetheless. And it makes me think of another book called The Slight Edge, one of my favorite books of all time. I'm going to reread that one just so I can do a summary on it, because it's so good. Deals a lot with the compound effect. Okay, that's it. That's it for Reuben's Corner and The Tipping Point. Thanks for watching.